The rain falls softly over Dublin as twilight settles across the city, casting long shadows over one of Ireland's most significant and haunting landmarks. Standing behind imposing stone walls in the Kilmainham district is Kilmainham Gaol, a prison whose history is deeply intertwined with the story of Ireland itself. Unlike many supposedly haunted locations that rely solely on folklore and legend, the fear associated with Kilmainham comes from something far more unsettling: the documented suffering of thousands of real people who lived, suffered, and died within its walls. Every corridor, every iron door, and every cold stone cell witnessed moments of despair that helped shape the course of Irish history. For more than a century, the prison served as a place of punishment, political repression, execution, and human tragedy. Today, it is remembered not only as a historical monument but also as one of Ireland's most chilling locations. The story begins in 1796 when the British administration opened a new prison officially known as the County Jail of Dublin. The prison replaced an older jail nearby that authorities considered inadequate for the growing population. Designed according to the penal philosophies of the late 18th century, Kilmainham was intended to represent a modern approach to incarceration. The reality, however, was far harsher. Men, women, and children were imprisoned under brutal conditions. The prison was built from cold limestone and featured narrow cells illuminated only by small windows. There was no heating. A single candle was often provided to prisoners every 2 weeks. During Ireland's harsh winters, inmates endured freezing temperatures while sleeping on rough bedding with little protection from the cold. One of the most disturbing realities of Kilmainham was the imprisonment of children. Historical records confirm that children as young as 7 years old were incarcerated there. Many had committed minor thefts, often stealing food or clothing simply to survive. Poverty in Ireland during the late 18th and early 19th centuries was widespread, and many families struggled daily to obtain basic necessities. For a starving child, stealing a loaf of bread could mean the difference between life and death. Yet the legal system showed little mercy. Young prisoners were frequently housed in conditions nearly identical to adults. Although separate sections existed for men and women, overcrowding often created severe difficulties. The psychological impact on these children is impossible to fully measure. Many spent weeks or months surrounded by hardened criminals while living in an atmosphere of constant fear. The early decades of the 19th century saw Kilmainham become increasingly crowded. Ireland was experiencing social unrest, economic hardship, and growing tensions between the population and British authorities. The prison quickly gained a reputation as a place where both ordinary criminals and political dissidents were confined. During the Irish Rebellion of 1798, numerous suspected rebels passed through its gates. The uprising, led in part by the Society of United Irishmen, sought to establish an independent Irish republic inspired by the American and French revolutions. Although the rebellion was ultimately suppressed, its aftermath filled prisons throughout Ireland, including Kilmainham. The prison's role in suppressing Irish nationalism continued throughout the 19th century. Following the failed Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848, several political activists were imprisoned there. The Young Ireland movement had emerged from growing frustration with British rule and sought greater Irish self-government. Though their rebellion was quickly defeated, the imprisonment of its participants further cemented Kilmainham's reputation as a prison of political significance. Then came one of the darkest periods in Irish history, the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852. Triggered by potato blight and worsened by political and economic factors, the famine devastated Ireland. More than 1 million people died, and millions more emigrated. During these years, Kilmainham experienced unprecedented overcrowding. Historical accounts reveal that some people deliberately committed petty crimes to gain entry into prison because incarceration offered a better chance of receiving food than remaining free during famine conditions. While prison life remained harsh, inmates at least received regular meals. The idea that people would willingly choose imprisonment over freedom illustrates the unimaginable suffering that existed outside the prison walls. Cells designed for one person often housed several inmates. Disease spread rapidly. Malnutrition weakened prisoners, and mortality rates increased. By the second half of the 19th century, Kilmainham had become closely associated with the growing movement for Irish independence. Members of the Fenian Brotherhood and the Irish Republican Brotherhood were among those incarcerated. The Fenian movement sought to establish an independent Irish republic through revolutionary means. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, British authorities used imprisonment as a tool to suppress nationalist activity. Political prisoners frequently found themselves confined alongside ordinary criminals, despite viewing themselves as soldiers fighting for a political cause. Among the most famous prisoners was Charles Stewart Parnell, one of the leading figures of Irish nationalism during the late 19th century. Parnell was imprisoned in Kilmainham in 1881 during the Land War, a campaign seeking fairer treatment for Irish tenant farmers. His imprisonment drew international attention and transformed Kilmainham into a symbol of political resistance. Although Parnell was eventually released following negotiations with the British government, his confinement further enhanced the prison's reputation as a place where Ireland's political future was often decided. Yet the events that would forever define Kilmainham Gaol occurred in 1916. By the early 20th century, Irish nationalism had intensified. Calls for independence were growing louder, and tensions between Irish nationalists and British authorities reached a breaking point. On Easter Monday, April 24, 1916, members of several nationalist organizations launched the Easter Rising in Dublin. Their objective was ambitious: the establishment of an independent Irish republic. For nearly a week, rebels fought British forces across the city. Although the uprising was eventually suppressed, its consequences would prove far more significant than anyone initially imagined. Following the surrender of rebel forces on April 29, 1916, British authorities arrested thousands of suspected participants and supporters. Many were transported to prisons and internment camps. Several of the rising's leaders were brought to Kilmainham Gaol to await court-martial proceedings. Within the prison's walls, military tribunals quickly sentenced key leaders to death. What followed remains one of the most consequential series of executions in modern Irish history. On May 3, 1916, Patrick Pearse, Thomas Clark, and Thomas MacDonagh were executed by firing squad in the prison's Stonebreakers Yard. The following day, May 4, Joseph Plunkett, Edward Daly, Michael O'Hanrahan, and William Pearse faced the same fate. On May 5, John McBride was executed. On May 8, Eamon Sent, Michael Mallon, Con Colbert, and Sean Houston were shot. Finally, on May 12, James Connolly, severely wounded during the rising and unable to stand, was tied to a chair before being executed. The image of Connolly facing death while strapped to a chair became one of the most powerful symbols of Irish resistance. The executions profoundly shocked public opinion throughout Ireland. Initially, many citizens had opposed the rising due to the destruction and civilian casualties it caused. However, the execution of its leaders generated widespread sympathy. Public sentiment shifted dramatically, creating momentum that would ultimately contribute to Ireland's path toward independence. The Stonebreakers Yard, where the executions occurred, became sacred ground in Irish memory. Following the Irish War of Independence from 1919 to 1921 and the subsequent establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, Kilmainham's role gradually diminished. The prison officially closed in 1924. For decades, the building fell into disrepair. Abandoned corridors echoed with silence where once thousands of prisoners had walked. Windows shattered. Roofs deteriorated. Vegetation crept across neglected stone walls. Some feared the prison would eventually be demolished altogether. Instead, preservation efforts began during the mid-20th century. Former prisoners, historians, volunteers, and community groups recognized the site's immense historical importance. Restoration projects gathered momentum throughout the 1960s and 1970s. In 1971, Kilmainham Gaol officially reopened as a museum dedicated to preserving Ireland's history. Today, visitors walk through restored cell blocks and stand in the same execution yard where the leaders of the Easter Rising met their deaths. The prison remains one of Ireland's most important historical sites. Yet alongside its historical significance, stories of unexplained experiences continue to emerge. Guides, visitors, and staff have occasionally reported unusual sounds, footsteps in empty corridors, doors seemingly moving without explanation, and an overwhelming sense of presence in certain areas of the building. While no scientific evidence confirms paranormal activity, the emotional atmosphere of Kilmainham is undeniable. Standing alone within its stone walls, surrounded by the memory of centuries of suffering, many visitors describe a feeling unlike any other historical site in Ireland. Perhaps the true horror of Kilmainham Gaol does not lie in ghost stories or supernatural legends. Perhaps its greatest terror comes from the reality of what happened there. The prison witnessed the imprisonment of starving children, the suffering of famine victims, the suppression of political movements, and the execution of men whose deaths changed the course of a nation. Unlike fictional haunted houses, the tragedy of Kilmainham is documented in records, letters, court documents, and eyewitness accounts. Every stone bears witness to lives interrupted by poverty, conflict, and political struggle. More than 200 years after its opening in 1796, Kilmainham Gaol remains a place where history feels hauntingly alive, reminding visitors that some of the most frightening stories are not legends at all, but real events that shaped the world we know today.